Listen, there's a poem. It speaks in the voice of England's past, like a flame beyond the language of the living. It's more than 1,000 years old, and yet it still speaks to us. It's called Beowulf. I'm going in search of the roots of this great poem and the barbaric splendor of the world it depicts.
It is not fantasy. This shows what a golden reality it was.
It's a world caught between the pagan and the Christian. It's a landscape inhabited by monsters.
If you see this monster's red, saucer-like burning eyes, you're dead.
It's the tale of a hero, Beowulf, who confronts a dragon in its mysterious lair.
The dragon came raging, spat death fire, war flashes blazed in the distance.
Its language has seduced a Nobel Prize-winning poet.
Marvellous to be reminded of the heft of words.
For the first time on television, we're allowed to examine the priceless original manuscript.
That's great, isn't it?
Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon poetry are at the root of the great tree of English language and literature which has spread across the whole of the planet. To my mind, it's our nation's greatest gift to the world. Beowulf is a work of the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes who came to our shores in the 5th century. So my journey in search of Beowulf starts on the east coast of England, where these tribes first settled in the Dark Ages.
The Anglo-Saxons were impoverished pagan immigrants who came to Britain at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire as economic migrants, seeking new life, new lands. And they sailed up these estuaries, the Stour, the Deben, the Orwell, and created their little kingdoms. They were a minority. They made little influence on our DNA. Our DNA as Britons is, in general, much older, but they had a profound effect on our society and our culture, and especially our language, and hence on our thought, for language is thought. The English we speak today is descended from their speech. Our most commonly used words are theirs: green, red, hand, body. Words that describe key concepts: mother, father, friend, love, hate, forgiveness, life, death, God. Core words that still define our beliefs, our emotions, and our relations as human beings. Now, though Beowulf is the earliest great work of English literature, it's not set in Britain. It's set in Denmark, with a little bit in Sweden, and in that sense, it's a post-migration tale. You think of the Irish or the Italians in America and the tenacity and affection with which they hold on to the memories of their European home. The Anglo-Saxons were like that. For centuries, they clung on to the myth of their coming. Take the famous 10th century poem, The Battle of Brunanburh. Sith an engel on Saxe, uppbekommen of our brad Brimu, since the Angles and the Saxons came up over the broad waves. Brichtene sochtan, ert begatten. They were seeking Britain, taking the land. Part of the appeal of poetry to the Anglo-Saxons lay in the power of those ancestral stories. And though many centuries separate us from the original audience, poetry like Beowulf can still be compelling. Like so many great Hollywood adventures, Beowulf is the perennial story of the hero's quest. The hero who fights monsters, saves his people, and finds himself. Now, the very best way to experience Beowulf is to see it spoken live. And I've come to Kent to see it performed in a fantastic full-scale recreation of an Anglo-Saxon royal hall. It's been built here in Wickhurst by the members of a historical reenactment society, Regia and Glorum, who were all hooked on the Anglo-Saxons and their world.
Hi, Kim. Good to see you again. Fantastic. God, absolutely fabulous, isn't it? Cool. Lummy, look at this. What is it about the Anglo-Saxon age that is so appealing?
What's not to love when you get to wear this kind of stuff, isn't it? Just fantastic, yeah.
Today, the group have come to hear a performance of Beowulf by actor Julian Glover. For the last 30 years, in between roles in Star Wars and Harry Potter, he's been doing a one-man show of the poem. And to get in the mood, his audience are preparing a Saxon feast.
Because the cut between.
The poem starts not with Beowulf himself, but with a flashback to another mythic hero, Scyld Scefing, a magic boy cast up on the shores of Denmark.
Wait! Here! Listen! We have heard of the thriving of the throne of Denmark. Was it not Scyld Scefing, who, found in childhood, lacked clothing? Yet he lived and prospered, grew in strength and stature under the heavens. That was good König. He was a good king.
To be a good king, it's a key idea in the poem. Now, one of Scyld's descendants, the Danish king Hrothgar, builds a great golden hall called Heorot, but in the darkness outside lurks a malevolent spirit.
Grendel, the fiend's name. Grim, infamous, wasteland stalker, master of the moor and the fen fortress. He found in Heorot the nobles, after carousing, slept after supper. Mad with rage, he struck quickly at this creature of evil. Grim and greedy, savage and unsparing, grasped 30 warriors, and away he was homeward, lusty with booty, laden with the slain. When the day broke, and with the dawn's light, Grendel's outrage was openly to be seen.
To the Anglo-Saxon audience, Grendel's rampage was not just a random act of terror. In attacking the Mead Hall, he was attacking society as a whole, for here the rituals were enacted which bound their society together.
So the hall is a centre of not only social order, but moral order. And when the monster comes in the night and starts to tear the king's followers limb from limb, it's time for the hero,
Beowulf.
He was of main strength foremost of all the men that trod the earth at that time, great-framed, great-heart. This prince picked his men from the flower of his folk, the fiercest among them that might be found, 14. Sea-skilled Beowulf led them down to the beach's fringe.
Beowulf's a young man at this point. He leaves his native Sweden and sails with his war band to Denmark, their mission to boldly go and rid Hrothgar's hall of its demonic invader. Now, far back in time, the story originated in oral tales. So how was the poem handed down to us across a distance of more than 1,000 years? And how did it become a literary classic? To find out, I've got an appointment at the British Library. The poem survived by sheer chance in a single manuscript. It's usually kept in the library's treasures room or in a security vault deep underground. Some would say it's our nation's most precious literary relic. Now, the Beowulf story looks back to the late 5th century. It was reworked and retold by the bards, as bards do. At some point, it was written down, and finally took the form we have it around the year 1000. This is a big thrill for me, to say the least. I first studied the Anglo-Saxon manuscripts in the old British Library when I was a student.
I never worked on the Beowulf manuscript. You simply weren't allowed to. It was too fragile. And it's never been filmed before. So this is quite an exciting moment.
The Beowulf manuscript was one of many medieval books in a private library, the Cotton Collection, which was devastated by fire in the 18th century.
Fantastic. Oh, look. God, now look at this. This is amazing, isn't it? What immediately becomes apparent is the fire of 1731, doesn't it?
Exactly. In 1731, the manuscripts were housed in Ashburnham House in London.
Fatefully named, isn't it? Ashburnham.
And a fire broke out, and many of the manuscripts were damaged. A few, unfortunately, were destroyed in their entirety. Reports say that fragments of manuscripts were seen floating in the wind like butterflies in the breeze.
Yes, I remember working on one of these years ago as a student, and the really badly burned ones of the vellum, the sheepskin, has just kind of crumpled up like that, hasn't it?
They're incredibly fragile, very brittle.
In the 19th century, the damaged Beowulf manuscript was rebound, keeping it in its original form as part of a compilation of stories written by the same two Anglo-Saxon scribes.
I mean, the compilation has all sorts of other things in it, doesn't it? I mean, actually, you're turning it there to monster pictures, aren't you? Yeah.
Here we have a picture from a text known as the Marvels of the East.
Yeah.
In the top, we have a headless man with his face and his chest.
Yeah.
We have two dragons, 150 foot long, and we have two camels. I call them comedy camels. But actually meant to represent elephants. The artist mistook them for camels.
Interesting, isn't it? These strange dragons and monsters. You can see the connection with Beowulf.
Well, exactly. The scribe was the same as for part of the Beowulf poem itself. So although this particular text doesn't have any relationship with the poem, it does signify that the scribes were actually interested in monsters itself.
It's small wonder then that a tale of creatures like Grendel should find a place in this medieval monster miscellany.
Let's turn to the beginning of the Beowulf manuscript itself.
Here we go. What? The opening words. Listen up. Listen. We gardena in year deum, theod kuningus, frimje frunon. Well, that's the beginning of the tale. That's great, isn't it?
Here's the passage where Beowulf and his 14 companions spend the night in Hrothgar's hall, knowing that Grendel will return.
On wanre nichte, skridan Genga. Gliding through the shadows came the walker in the night. The warriors slept, all except one, and this man kept an unblinking watch. He waited, pent heart swelling with anger against his foe. From off the moorland's misting fells came Grendel stalking. The Kerm of Mura under Misliuthum, Grendel Gongan. He moved through the dark, saw with perfect clearness the gold-panelled hall, mead drinking place of men. The door gave way at a touch of his hands. Rage inflamed, wreckage bent, he tore the hall's jaws. Hastening onwards, angrily advancing, from his eyes shot a light in unlovely form of fire. He saw in the hall the host of young warriors, and in his heart exulted, horrible monster, all his hopes swelling to a gluttonous meal. As a first step, he set his greedy hands on a sleeping soldier, savagely tore him, gnashed at his bone joints, bolted huge gobbets, sucked at his veins, and had soon eaten all of the man to his fingers and feet. Then he moved forward, reached to seize our warrior, Beowulf, stretched out for him with his spite-filled fist. But the faster man, forestalling, rose up on his arm and quickly gripped that sickening hand. Hateful to each was the breath of the other. Rip! In the giant flesh frame showed then. Shoulder muscles sprang apart, a snapping of tendons, bone locks burst. The arm of the demon was severed from his side, and Grendel flew death-sick to his joyless den, where he knew that the end of his life was in sight. Beowulf had cleansed Heorot, saved the whole from persecution, and as a signal to all, the hero hung the hand, the arm and torn off shoulder, the entire limb, Grendel's whole grip, beneath the soaring roof.
And so the first part of the poem ends. To us, the basic arc of narrative in Beowulf is quite familiar, but around the manuscript itself, there's still a real mystery. We don't know when or where the poem was initially composed and performed. And we don't know where the successive oral retellings were finally shaped into this written version. But within the poem, there are clues to its origin. So first of all, to find out where the original oral poem and its poet might have come from, I'm heading to one of the earliest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, in East Anglia. This is the town of Woodbridge on the River Deben in Suffolk. Like most places around here, its roots lie over 1,000 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon period. All around us are signposts to the Anglo-Saxon past. Downriver is Kingston, the tun or farm of the kings of the East Angles. And upriver is Ufford, the ford of Wuffa the wolf, one of their 6th century kings. And on the other shore is the site of the greatest archaeological discovery ever made in the British Isles.
And of course, this is the return of the boat-born hero to Sutton Hoo.
Beowulf expert Dr. Sam Newton, like me, is fascinated by the story of Sutton Hoo, a place with old legends of royal tombs and hidden gold.
You've got so many stories of buried treasure in this corner of Suffolk. No doubt people would be imagining all sorts of treasure buried there. But in this particular case, Elizabeth I's astrologer, Dr. John Dee, is said to have dug here. And then the great lady who owned the land here in the 1930s, old Edith Pretty, she was certainly a lady who was interested in legends. And we know she took part in the Woodbridge Spiritualist congregation across the river here. And on the basis of all that, she became convinced that there was gold in her hills. And which is what, of course, led to...
And there was!
Yeah, exactly. Talk about dreams come true.
Edith Pretty's dreams centred on several mysterious mounds scattered around the area known as Sutton Hoo. Hoo meaning promontory in Anglo-Saxon. In 1938, she finally approached local archaeologist Basil Brown to investigate.
When I came over, I met Mrs. Pretty and walked down to the mound, and I said, which would you like excavated? And she said, what about that one?
In May 1939, Brown began excavating, helped by the local gamekeeper and by Mrs. Pretty's gardener. Driving a trench from the east end of the mound, they traced rows of ship rivets still in position. Soon, they uncovered the ghost of a great ship with an undisturbed burial chamber. They'd found an Anglo-Saxon ship burial. And it lay beneath the exact spot where Mrs. Pretty had told Brown to dig.
And look, you can see the post there marking the site of the prow of the ship.
Oh, yeah.
And the stern right out there.
So this is the ship length here.
Exactly. The line of the keel is something like 90 feet. I mean, that's a massive ship, even by today's standards on the river.
Yeah.
And this beautiful ship, what a way to go. And of course, it brings with it the notion that death is but a point of embarkation in a journey. Yeah. You know, it must have meant so much to them, hence the effort of bringing this massive ship, six tons at least, win light, all the way up here. And of course, this is where Beowulf comes in, because the opening movement of the poem culminates with a magnificent account of a royal ship funeral.
A boat with a ringed neck rode in the haven. And there they laid out their lord and master, giver of wound gold, in the waist of the ship, in majesty by the mast. A mound of treasures from far countries was fetched aboard her, and it is said that no boat was ever more bravely fitted out with the weapons of a warrior, war accoutrement, swords and body armour. High overhead they hoisted and fixed a gold signum, gave him to the flood, let the seas take him.
And around him, the ancestral treasures.
Yeah.
And that's in the poem, isn't it, in Beowulf?
Theodiestriona, the folk treasures.
Fantastic.
The crown jewels, if you like.
No trace of the body of the dead king was ever found, but the extraordinary treasures buried with him caused a sensation.
Rewrote English history almost.
Yes, because this has opened up a lost chapter of English history, a golden age, no less.
But had an extraordinary impact on the study of Beowulf too.
Well, it is not fantasy. This shows what a golden reality it was.
Yeah, I mean the poet describes these kind of talismanic artifacts.
Absolutely,
that are almost endowed with a kind of magical power, aren't they? The gifts between kings and their warrior heroes. And you think it's just a poet talking, and then under this mound, there they are.
The most magnificent find was a ceremonial helmet. When reconstructed, this literally fabulous piece revealed more close connections with the Beowulf poem.
Look at this awesome face, Michael.
So fantastic, isn't it?
It is.
You see the boar's
heads
there with the boar's tusks.
Exactly located, as in the Beowulf description. Eovelictionon over Cleobergan. The boar-shaped shone over the cheek guards. It protected the lives of the war-minded warriors. You know, in other words, what to us is an inanimate metal decoration, for them is an animate agent of protection. You get the impression that no helmet without a boar helmet would be considered safe.
So, $64,000 question, Sam. Whose helmet was this?
Good question. On the present evidence, the unavoidable conclusion is a king called Radwold. Not just a king of East Anglia, one of the first overlords of Britain.
And it's in the family tree of Redwald and the East Anglian kings that we find the next clue that may connect the Beowulf poet to this corner of England.
The Wuffings, the name of the East Anglian royal family, named after their eponymous hero Wuffa, means little wolf. Wuffings are wolfings. And of course the wolfings are quite big in the world of Beowulf. What's more, we can identify the Danish queen Wealhtheow as an East Anglian dynastic ancestor. And the name of one of her children, namely Hrothmund, is listed in the upper reaches of the East Anglian royal pedigree.
Okay.
And as a royal name, you don't get it in any other early source.
Wow. This suggests then that the author of Beowulf was well aware of the pedigree of the East Anglian royal family.
Well, yeah, it's great, isn't it? It's a rather unavoidable conclusion.
Yeah. It might suggest that Beowulf at some stage went through a stage of composition here in East Anglia, and if so, where?
Very appropriately, we're just crossing the parish boundary to Rendlesham, the known site of East Anglian royal authority. This is, in the Old English, a Cúnla Cantuna, a kingly town, a Kingston, no less.
I think these links that Sam argues are persuasive and exciting. Here in Suffolk, you feel you can almost touch the world of the Beowulf poet. The area by the later medieval church of St. Gregory at Rendlesham is the most likely site for the Royal Hall, where the East Anglian kings might have listened to their court poets.
So when we talk about a royal residence in the 7th century, we're talking about all the service industries being here as well, aren't we?
Oh, yes.
I mean, the metal workers, the craftspeople, maybe the people who made the jewellery at Sutton Hoo.
And of course, most central of all, the great Golden Hall. The focus for assembly, for royal audiences, a great barn-like structure, nothing less than the Camelot of the North, this great ideal of which this would be a reality.
And in it, the poets entertain the king and his warriors.
Absolutely.
Telling tales of...
No feast is complete without the poets telling us their entertainment.
Right. And we can imagine that, well, almost on this spot. I mean, within this immediate area.
Yes, absolutely. All the indications are here.
Now, it came into his mind that he would command the construction of a huge mead hall, a house greater than men on earth ever had heard of, and share the gifts God had bestowed on him upon its floor with folk young and old. There was music of the harp, sweet minstrel singing, perfect in telling of the remote first making of the race of man.
A possible East Anglian origin for the poem is hinted at not only in the Sutton Hoo treasure and the family tree of the kings, it's also suggested by the landscape itself. The brooding fens of the poem are still to be found here in Suffolk. On a frosty morning, you can easily imagine ogres emerging from the mist. But there's a twist. From the 7th century, the kings here were Christian, and in those days the fens were the scene of spirit wars. One missionary saint, St. Botolph, founded his monastery in these marshes. From here, he would go out and fight fen demons with prayer, just as pagan heroes like Beowulf fought to rid Hrothgar's kingdom of monstrous marsh dwellers like Grendel. Their weapons were different, but the saint and the hero inhabit the same landscape.
Don't forget, Anglo-Saxon England, the England of Beowulf, was a wild and underpopulated land. There were no real towns. The forests were full of wolves, and the isolated farms and settlements, the lonely monasteries like the one that stood on that promontory there, Icon, were little centres of human life amidst a vast, untamed nature. Their mental world was surrounded by monsters, and the unseen to them was palpable, and all was threatened to burst over the threshold into the real. And in the story of Beowulf, after the killing of Grendel, the next eruption from the demonic, chthonic, watery depths of the mere was, to the early medieval mind, and maybe to ours still too, even more threatening because it was female. Grendel's mother.
Grendel's mother now purposed, black-hearted, gluttonous, on a wrath-bearing visit of vengeance for her son. She descended on Heorot, and fate swept on its wheel when the mother of Grendel found her way among those men. She grasped a man quickly. The king's good friend, Ashera, clutched him to herself and was away to the fen. Beowulf was not there. Heorot was in uproar. Grendel's hand had gone with her.
From Beowulf to the alien, the mother monster has an honoured place in horror stories. Grendel's mother may be fearsome, but she still feels a mother's bond to her child. And to the poet, that's even a source of imaginative sympathy. It makes her more than just a scary monster. She's a perverse mirror to mankind. And the poet strengthens that connection for his audience by giving his demons a biblical origin.
In the poem, Grendel and his kin are described as the seed of Cain. That's the son of Adam in the Bible, who'd committed the primordial crime of brother killing, for which he and his descendants would be cast out forever, exiled, fated to wander, fated always to fight their battle against humanity and goodness. And in the poem, Grendel is described as Ald Yawina, the old enemy, and even better, Fiend Mannequinus. It hardly needs translating, does it? The fiend of mankind. Those ideas and images come all the way down to Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and out in the landscape today, you can still find their traces.
Here in East Anglia, the name of Grendel is still applied to marshy pits and watercourses. Today they call them grindles. And the idea of a Grendel-like fen monster as an enemy of Christianity is one that has also hung on here. I've come to the medieval church of Blythburgh to meet a local folklore expert, Peter Jennings.
Take a look at this. Cathedral of the Marshes. There was never more than 100 houses in Blythburgh, and yet this fantastic big place. Of course, there was a monastery.
7th century.
7th century.
Time of Beowulf.
Yes.
This was already
yes.
here. So what's the legend of this place then, Pete?
Well, the tale goes that 4th of August, 1577, huge thunderstorms. And of course, the thunderstorm is when you expect Wotan and his wild hunt to descend with his devil dog, Black Shuck.
Shuck? This is an ancient Anglo-Saxon word, actually, Peter, isn't it? I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
It means it's kind of monster in Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, from Shukka.
Yeah.
Shukka, yeah.
So it's a devil dog?
Yes. Black and shaggy, saucer-like burning eyes.
This is very interesting, isn't it? Just like
Grendel with the light, the baleful light in the eyes.
Yeah.
Doesn't like the sound of singing, all this Christian stuff.
Just like Botulf's demons in the fens?
Yes, exactly. And Black Shuck comes down and down the aisle. A man and a boy get in his way. They die. Because the belief is, as if you look into those fiery saucer-like eyes, you're dead. If not then, within a 12-month. People get out of the way, and of course he sort of charges through. And this is a bit I've really got to show you. You're going to love this. So Black Shuck goes to this door, the north door. Now, the north door belongs to the devil in the church, as far as East Anglian folklore goes, and this is where his claw marks burnt their way into that door, and they have been there for a very long time.
So the East Anglian Tourist Board in Tudor times really got to work here, didn't they? Yeah, fantastic.
Believe it or not, as you like.
By Tudor times, bogies like Black Shuck were fading into folklore. But the Anglo-Saxons believed in the reality of supernatural forces that could only be defeated by magic, whether by the cross of the saintly exorcist or by the sword of the hero. In the poem, when Beowulf pursues Grendel's mother to her lair, it's a magic sword that pulls him through.
Then he saw, among the armour on the wall, a giant sword from former days. This wonder was so enormous that no other man would be equal to bearing it in battle play. Well, it was a giant's forge that had fashioned it so well. The Geat champion, shaking now with war rage, caught it by the rich hilt, and careless of his life, brandished its circles and brought it down in fury to catch her full and fairly, biting into the neck. Yay! The blade sheared through the backbone. The sword was gory. He was glad at the deed.
For the Anglo-Saxons, weapons like Beowulf's blade had supernatural power, and the very process of forging them must have seemed like a kind of spell working. Hector Cole is one of the very few people today who know how to forge weapons as the Anglo-Saxons did.
It's a magic process, isn't it? You can see why ancient societies thought the smith was somehow a magician.
Oh, absolutely. It goes back into the early iron working when the iron was a gift from the gods, because it literally came from the heavens in the meteors. And man has captured that, and he can work it, and he's using earth, he's using fire, he's using wind, he's using water, he's using all the elements, and then his skill to actually create these magical pieces of work.
And they saw the process from a shapeless lump of what looks like rock to a beautiful, deadly and extraordinary artefact. It's a secret, isn't it? A mystery.
It is a mystery.
In creating his blade, the swordsmith would first make several separate rods and then twist them, weld them together and hammer them flat. And it was the twisting of the rods which gave each Anglo-Saxon sword its individual personality. creating intricate patterns in the beaten blade.
Wow. Oh, just look at that. Can you see the pattern in it? There's the strange poisoned branches, aren't they? And God, it's just great, isn't it? It is like waves, exactly as the Anglo-Saxon says. The way are swayord.
It's rippling, yes.
You see something into their world, don't you, when you look into these patterns?
Oh, yes.
Then Helfdener's son presented Beowulf with a gold standard as a victory gift, an embroidered banner, also breastmail and a helmet and a sword carried high. That was both precious object and token of honor.
So the poem's world and its honored heroes were pagan. And yet, the poet himself was Christian. After all, even the monsters are seen in biblical terms as Cain's kin. And that cultural tension between the pagan and the Christian lies at the very heart of the poem. But what does that tell us about Beowulf and its audience? To find out, I'm travelling to the northeast, to what was once the ancient kingdom of Northumbria. In early Anglo-Saxon times, the area around Newcastle was the intellectual powerhouse of Christian England.
This journey is a kind of pilgrimage to me, if that doesn't sound too corny. Whenever I'm up in the northeast, I always try and make the trip across to a small former mining and shipbuilding village on the south bank of the Tyne. It's because it was there in the early 8th century that the Northumbrian monk Bede, who was a Sunderland man, wrote his famous book. He called it The Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation. It's a kind of defining text of the Anglo-Saxon age, but it also, it seems to me, throws fascinating light onto the context of Beowulf. And he wrote it in Jarrow. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But this is one of the most resonant landscapes in British history. It's a typical Anglo-Saxon monastic site, a bit like Icon in Suffolk, on a promontory between two rivers. Just look, the River Tyne flowing down to the sea at Tynemouth, and right below us, the River Don, now a blackened industrial stream, a really sad sight. And behind me, where the petrol storage terminal is and the serried ranks of Nissan cars, was a huge tidal pool. Jarrow Slake comes from a good old English word, slakian, to fill up, as in to slake your thirst.
Looking at the Slake today, you might think that Bede's landscape is gone forever, but the remains of his monastery are still here. This is one of the root places of Englishness.
So there you are. This is what survives of the Anglo-Saxon monastery of Jarrow, built in 681. This is where Bede spent his whole life from the age of 7. There's a wonderful story of him at the age of 14 as the only survivor, along with the abbot, of a terrible outbreak of plague, still managing to keep the services going. And this is where, in old age, he wrote his great book. And the core idea of the narrative is conversion.
The way Bede tells it, the conversion of the pagan English was pretty straightforward. Great kings would see the divine light and be converted, and their nobles and their people would just follow. But in reality, the conflict between Christianity and paganism was long drawn out and never conclusively won.
And in the cultural battles and spirit wars of the 8th century, poetry was a key medium, and it was fought over. Just look at this. This is a letter from a Northumbrian cleric, and he's talking about what went on at the monks' feasts inside monasteries and the popularity of poems like Beowulf. Verba Dei legantur in sacerdotali convivio. The word of God should be read in the communal feasts of the monks, not the pagan poems, the pagan songs. Quid ingeldus cum Christo? What has Ingeld to do with Christ? Ingeld's a hero mentioned in Beowulf. It almost sounds as if it's an attack on Beowulf itself, doesn't it? And here's the punchline. Angusta est domus. The house of Christ is narrow and cannot include both the works of the church fathers and the poems of the pagan poets.
But as so often in history, the old ways are tenacious. They're never swept away overnight. And the old poetry, the very voice of the early English, found a new subject.
We've come to this remote corner of Dumfriesshire in Scotland, in what was the Kingdom of Northumbria in Anglo-Saxon times, to find one of the most interesting monuments from that age. It's in the church here at Roughwell, and it's got quite a story to tell.
In a later time of spirit wars, the Protestant Reformation, this monument was deemed idolatrous. In the 17th century, it was broken up by zealous Presbyterians, and pieces were thrown into a pit. But later still, it was reassembled. It's a great stone cross from the age of Beowulf.
Here it is. This is the cross today. Isn't that fantastic? It's an Anglo-Saxon preaching cross, nearly 18 feet high. When it was made, you've got to imagine bright colours, reds and purples, yellows, whites, gilt for the halos on Christ and the saints. And on it, text and images from the Christian story. They're just great, aren't they? This is Mary Magdalene washing Christ's feet and drying it with her hair. Come and have a look round the side. It's amazingly well preserved, given that it was smashed into bits, isn't it? Now look at this. Wonderful image here of Christ standing on the head of what one can only call monsters. It's an allusion to the Psalms, the triumph over the devil through the treading down of serpents and dragons and basilisks and lions. Very Beowulfian, isn't it? Now here's the most fantastic element of this amazing monument. You see running down the side in the two strips, a bit worn, but you can see these are runes. These are the script of the ancient Germanic peoples.
The runes quote from a poem, which after Beowulf is one of the greatest works of Anglo-Saxon literature. It's called The Dream of the Rood, and it shows how the old pagan themes in poetry were carried down to enrich the Christian imagination, and even to help conversion.
The poem takes the form of a dream vision. The poet is the dreamer. He has the vision in the middle of the night. And it's an incredibly archaic idea. It's like the ancient shamans or spirit mediums who ascend to the gods to gain their secret knowledge and bring it back for the benefit of humankind. It's an idea that's thousands of years older than Christianity.
The poet's vision is of Christ's cross. Listen, he says, I will tell the best of dreams, which I had at midnight when all the world sleeps. I dreamt I saw a wondrous tree, towering in the sky above me, suffused with light, the brightest of beams. And then that most beautiful of trees spoke these words. Long ago it was. I still remember it. I stood on the edge of the forest when they came to cut me down. Strong foes carried me away and set me on a hill. And then the young hero, Christ, Firm and unflinching, stripped himself, brave in the sight of all, minded to save mankind. And I trembled when the hero clasped me, and they pierced me with dark nails. All creation wept, lamenting the king's death.
Christ has become, by now, the Germanic hero, victorious even in his defeat. And the tree takes on the persona of a loyal member of the war band. I could have killed them all, the tree says, those fiendus, the same word as in Beowulf. But the tree, out of loyalty to the Lord, must become the instrument of his death.
By equating the pagan tree of life with Christ's cross, the Christian poet created something uniquely English, which could reconcile people to the new religion.
So there's a fabulous blurring of theological boundaries, if I can put it that way, between the pagan and the Christian in the Dream of the Rood. You've got Christ as the leader of the war band, speaking trees and cosmic magic, just as in Beowulf. You've got Holy God, the creator of the world, and the sins of the seed of Cain. And maybe that helps us understand how the poem actually worked for an Anglo-Saxon audience.
It's been said that the Christianity in Beowulf is just a veneer, but in its vivid portrayal of the pagan past, the poem honoured the ancestors and allowed the old world to live on in the new. After all, to them, the pagan past, like the Christian future, was still God-given.
The minstrel told how long ago the Lord formed earth. Exulting, the Lord established the sun and the moon as lamps to illumine the land dwellers, loaded the acres of the world in the jewel work of branch and leaf, bringing then to life each kind of creature that creeps and moves.
And so we come to the poem's final act. In a few lines, the poet jumps 50 years. Beowulf is the king of his people, the Geats, but now he's an old man.
50 winters he ruled, grew grey in guardianship of the land, till one began, a horde-guarding dragon, to put forth his power in the pitch-black night time. He guarded a gold hoard in a towering stone burial mound. Men knew not his entrance, but one day a slave on the run from a flogging felt his way in. When he saw the dragon there, he was struck with great terror, but even so, stole from thence a solid gold cup.
His treasure hoard violated, the enraged dragon lays waste to Beowulf's kingdom. Even the royal hall is destroyed before the dragon retreats to his lair. And it's the dragon's lair which is the scene of Beowulf's final battle. The Anglo-Saxons had a vivid sense of living in an old landscape, with prehistoric long barrows and standing stones all around them.
The great stone circles to their poets were the work of giants, wondrous work of wall stones, and the ancient Stone Age burial mounds were heathen burials, places where the ancestral treasures were stored up and guarded by dragons. This is one of them. It's still known as Wayland's Smithy. Wayland was the Anglo-Saxon divine blacksmith, the man who created the magical swords and coats of chain mail for the gods.
And even on a bright day, under a cloud-flecked sky, it still feels like a place of mystery. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, these standing stones were like entry points to the underworld. And local legends have hung around this Oxfordshire long barrow for many centuries.
It was said that if you left your shoes here with a silver penny, Wayland would shoe them for you. And this is the kind of place the Anglo-Saxon audience imagined the location for Beowulf's final struggle. He's like the old gunslinger in a Western movie who must face one last deadly enemy. And of course he knows what will happen because, as the poet says, although his fate is unknowable, it's still certain.
The war-seasoned king sat down on the headland, spoke encouraging words to the friends of his hearth, but gloomy his spirits, death-eager, wandering. He knew that fate waited to seek his soul's hoard. Him was Cheomer Sepha Wefron Welfus, Wyrdan Gemeteneach Seithan Gomelan, Greatan Sheolda Sekan soul hoard. His fate hovered near, unknowable but certain.
That ruminative, fatalistic quality, I think, is the key to Beowulf. In 1999, a new translation appeared that caught that field better than any before. Incredibly, Beowulf topped the bestsellers and won the Book of the Year, captured the imagination of a new generation of readers. And it was written by the Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney. For Heaney, even the dragon itself must act according to its fate.
The way that the dragon is described is kind of, he's full of sinuous energy. He is the worm, as they say in the Anglo-Saxon. He has been attacked himself, he's been provoked, and he just has to follow his nature, as dragons do. When they're waking up, they go around and burn villages. So there's no sense of him being a malignant figure coming to do damage to Beowulf. They're both caught in this web. They are encountering a destiny, encountering their fate. The poem is about tests in many ways. I mean, Beowulf is tested 3 times, and the first 2 are warrior tests. But I do feel that the third one is somehow more than war. It's a spiritual test of a different sort. And that calls, I think, to something in the reader. There's a sense of having to live up to your own best possibilities, not failing something. And Beowulf is full of comprehension, facing the end.
Now old Beowulf enters the dragon's den, accompanied by Wiglaf, the one young warrior who has the courage to stand by his king.
The dragon came raging, attacked once again, terrifier flashing, rushed in on our king, crushed all his neck between bitter pangs. Wiglaf then, disregarding the head, struck below it, aimed true, and the fire quickly slackened in consequence. Then Beowulf, recovering, reached for his stabbing knife, hewed mightily down, hacked the dragon in half. So, daring drove out life. Ferch Ellen Rek. And the king saw the last triumph of his works in the world. His wound burned and swelled, the bane boiled in his chest. He walked away thinking, sat down on a ledge and surveyed the old earth all. Wiglaf took water and washed his good lord, bathed away battle blood, loosened his helmet.
Keats talked about a poem, writing and setting, and I think that that is rather beautiful in Beowulf. As the poem proceeds, there is the development of the central character of Beowulf himself, who comes on as a young man, a brave cowboy coming into town to win glory. And as it proceeds, to use something else that Keats said, he is an intelligence who is schooled by the pains of the world into being a soul. And I think something like that happens in the course of the poem, and there is a beautiful transformation occurs from young valor to old intuitive sympathy, and Virgil would say lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. The Anglo-Saxon melancholy merges with, I think, the whole European sense of tragedy. And that's what I loved about it.
We've almost reached the end of the tale. But before that, there's one last question. Where might the poem have been finally committed to writing at the end of the 10th century?
The poem, remember, was originally composed in the Anglian dialect of Anglo-Saxon. But in the form that we've got it in that manuscript, it's gone through a final versioning by a scribe writing in West Saxon. And where that might have taken place, the clues lie not in Beowulf itself, but in the other items in the manuscript in London. The Book of Monsters, Alexander's letter to Aristotle with its fabulous tales of ant lions and weird tribes across to the sunset, the Wonders of the East with its story of peoples whose heads were in their chests. Now, there's only one Anglo-Saxon monastery which is known to have possessed all the Latin sources for those stories, and it's this one, Malmesbury in Wiltshire, on the borders of Wessex and Mercia, a place with an ancient, long tradition of vernacular and Latin poetry, in a lot of which there's a healthy interest in dragons too. And if I had to place a small bet, I would guess that it was here that the story reached its final point in its long journey, handed down from the mouths of the bards, finally to the pen of the scribe.
It's a miracle it survived. Like all of Anglo-Saxon poetry, it's astonishing to think that the very root of our literary heritage only just got through. The faded ink, the singed vellum, the crumbling margins, carrying the word hoard down to us. And the poem itself ends in flames, with Beowulf's body taken to a headland by the sea in his Geat kingdom.
The Geat race then raised up a funeral pyre. Shining mail and shields of war and helmets hung upon it. They laid out in the middle the body of their chief, and on top there then kindled the biggest funeral fire. The roaring of flames mingled with weeping as the fire's red heart consumed the house of bone. Heaven swallowed the smoke. This was the manner of the mourning of the Geats. They said he had proved of all kings in the world the gentlest of men, the most gracious, the kindest to his people, the keenest for fame.
So Beowulf lives and dies as a noble pagan ancestor should, but with a virtue and a morality that his Christian descendants could admire. He was a good king. He was god König, who ruled wisely. Wisdom held Ethelsine. And now in the 21st century, with wars on terror and clashes of civilizations, the poem can still speak to us. With its pagan humanism, the refinement of its manners, its generosity of spirit. And it's in our voice that, however great a distance, it's our speech. Ironical, self-deprecating, quite tough-minded. And it's safe to say that the poem will be remembered as long as there's poetry in these islands, until the dragon comes.
Coming up next tonight here on BBC4 Comedy, as we join the Walking Club in the great outdoors.